Salam al-Masih. Welcome to Jim Apologetics. This is, of course, your host, Jim. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll respond to any good comments when I have the time to. I apologize for the delay since my last videos, but before I get on to any large topics, I'd like to discuss an interview that was sent to me, which I'm going to link in the description of this channel, this video, of biblical scholar Michael S Heiser. He did an interview on a YouTube channel called The Looking Glass, talking primarily about the interpretation of the Bible, Old and New Testament, through the cultural lens that it was written in. So the era, the language, the place, and the events that conspired around them, influencing the writers in how they explain their theology. Now, as a Christian, I don't believe that culture will permeate into actual large-scale theology, such as doctrines of the Trinity, monotheism, incarnation, and the core issues of theology that all Christians believe in and agree with, because these are inspired by God, who is not going to be partial only to one culture when it comes to metaphysics. However, when it comes to how the writers explain their theology, we have to look at the culture they were brought up in. Michael S Heiser begins by discussing the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the Qumran caves in the nation of Jordan. And in these caves they found a variety of different writings. They looked at the writings of the Essenes, a strange, esoteric, aesthetic, monk-style sect of Judaism, heretical both to Judaism and Christianity today, but also fragments of the Old Testament in Hebrew that match more closely to the Greek Septuagint than to the Masoretic text. He explains, of course, that the Masoretic text is far from perfect. It contains many varieties and variations, and there isn't really one Masoretic text. So he, like your host Jim, would agree that the Septuagint is the more pure and authoritative example of the Old Testament. And in fact, it is the Old Testament that Paul and all the other apostles, and even Christ himself, quote the most, the Septuagint translation. Maybe they're not always quoting it in Greek, but there is the Hebrew version of the Greek Septuagint that Jews themselves were obviously reading. He also speaks about how Judaism is not one coherent denomination, just like there are many denominations of Christianity, and in that time period there were many denominations of Judaism. So I'm in complete agreement with all of these thoughts so far. You can check out my playlist on Rabbinic Judaism and how it has changed over time. But primarily in the video, the points that I did like the most is his focus on looking at the cultural milieu that brought about the explanations for the theology that was being presented in the Bible. So the writing style of Paul, the writing style of Daniel the prophet, the writing style found by Moses, written by Moses in the book of Genesis and the other books of the Torah. We have to look at the culture that they were brought up in. Michael S Heiser goes on to explain a few interesting details, one that I never thought of. For instance, the Tower of Babel was most likely a ziggurat, because it appeared in Mesopotamia, and the format of building large structures were the ziggurats. The ziggurats were, of course, pagan temples, so this was an offense to God. What we find in the Bible is that the tower is being built by people who shared one language and wanted to reach a tower that would reach into the heavens, and of course, usurp and insult God. So Michael S Heiser then goes on to describe that the rest of the peoples of the earth got divorced by God, sent into other areas, and they were temporarily worshipping their own pagan deities, who were substitutes for the one God, as they did not believe in the one God, but that the people of Israel, chosen through the line of Abraham, were specifically married in a way to God and chosen by him. The people didn't just decide one day, let's have one God. The Lord decided to have the Israelites as his people and his champions, and later on, through all the prophets, would be Israelites. And so he goes on to explain this. He also explains, like I said, the cultural milieu. Why is Paul writing in a way that mirrors the writing style of the prophet Daniel, for instance? Because these are the scriptures that they are reading from. They are inspired by. So even though we read the Old Testament today, and we are interpreting it culturally through our own culture, or maybe even through the culture of, say, the Byzantine interpretations if you're Eastern Orthodox, while none of these are wrong theologically, we're not getting the full grasp of the culture for each word being written. And I did an old video called The Bible Wasn't Written in English, or something of that matter, where I discussed through the Syriac Aramaic lens the falsity, or I guess incompletion, of interpreting the Bible through just an anglicized lens, and not looking at the original Semitic Aramaic lens that it was written in, particularly for the New Testament translation found in the Peshitta, and also the Aramaic culture of Palestine and the greater region of Syria at that time. Further, Michael S Heiser goes on to describe that the gods, or Elohim, are referred to in relation to the stars, moon, and sun in the book of Deuteronomy. And this is interesting because it is a way of describing the pagan gods in the Old Testament. They are called gods, and you'll notice even in Exodus, the Lord declares that he is greater than all the other gods. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that there are multiple gods? Some kind of conspiratorial idea that the Christian church has been hiding? No. What it means, actually, is that the other gods, if they're really real metaphysically, then they are demons. They're not actually creators. They're not really gods who created the universe. But rather, they are fallen angels, aka demons, who take on the guise of a god and accept worship and filthy sacrifices in order for those people to be under their domain. And that is what biblical scholar Heiser talks the most about when speaking of these pagan gods, that these pagan nations are under the domain of those gods, whether they are real metaphysical demonic beings or even just false exaggerations. They are under the influence and domain of those pagan gods, whereas the Israelites are only in the influence of the one Lord. Now, of course, if you read the Old Testament, you know the Jews fail again and again and again, and the Israelites go and adopt paganism many times. And so much of the story of the Old Testament is God commanding and trying to prevent his people from being adulterous toward him, essentially, and going and being betrothed instead with these disgusting pagan gods, and adopting foreign influences, because they alone were established as the chosen people to follow the one God and set an example for the world, and later on, through Christ, the light towards all the Gentile nations. So much of the Old Testament story is based on the one God and the Israelites, and the pagan gods having their domain with the Gentile people. I don't agree with every single thing Michael Heiser says. He speaks about how church tradition sometimes is flawed and that it gets in the way of looking at scripture properly, but I would argue that actually in times past, when Europe was much more Christian, and we're talking about the Middle Ages and even the ancient period, they were interpreting the scripture in a way more clearly and actually more appropriate than many people interpret it today. Because today we have a much more commercialized, westernized lens, and English being the common language of the world at the moment, we are looking at things through a language that is much, much more divorced from the original language of the Bible than people who were comfortable in the Eastern and even Western Mediterranean with the culture of their very neighbors. In addition, you had patriarchs from North Africa, as well, including Egypt, from Anatolia, Syria, Jerusalem, who were going and joining the rest of European Christianity and teaching them their own culture, and together they were combining culture, theology, and knowledge into how they understand the Bible. So I would argue that in the ancient times and the middle times and even in the medieval era, people were interpreting the scripture in a way more pure to its source than people do today. And he would argue that, well, now we have better scholarship, so we can look at it through a more Syro-Aramaic lens. But I would argue that we already had the Syro-Aramaic lens, and it's been lost more in translation over time, because as Christianity moved further and further away from the Middle East, and people who were not at all associated with the old world, such as us living here in the new world, had absolutely no idea how to interpret it. And especially in a westernized, secularized, commercialized society, we have no way of knowing the proper and true culture found in these areas. You also have to remember that the Christian population of the Middle East, up until maybe 100 or so years ago, was dramatically more influential and much more populous. Only 150 years ago, maybe even sooner than that, Christians were nearly a quarter of the population of the Middle East. That includes, of course, some Greeks and Armenians, but also Semitic, Arabic, Coptic, and Syriac speaking Christians who were very comfortable with their own culture. And so to act like it was an entirely Muslim area and we had lost all this knowledge is false. It's mainly because Christians have a lower influence in Christianity overall today that we're losing some of that focus. I would argue that Christians from the Middle East had a greater influence, not just in the ancient period, but even just a couple hundred years ago. I disagree with Heiser on that, but I do agree with his principle of looking at the Bible in the culture and context it was written. So I'm leaving the link to that interview in the description below. I will be continuing on to some other great topics. If you have any great ideas, let me know. I may or may not actually get around to them. Like I said, I'm kind of reorganizing the channel, focusing on some new topics as well. And hit me up on Discord. I'm very present on there. I like to do debates and talks on there. And yeah, thank you all for being patient, and I will see you next time.